I thought I was building the life I'd always dreamed of, moving to a quiet town, finding someone who felt like home. But then, I started noticing strange behavior. Her phone always on silent, late nights out with her friend Brad. The real shock? I hired a private investigator, and what he uncovered left me shattered. Turns out, the life I was building was all based on a lie. I'm Alex. I'm 27, and I made the decision to leave the big city I grew up in to search for a quieter, simpler life. Los Angeles was full of bright lights and endless opportunities, but it was also crowded, expensive, and honestly, a little lonely. It wasn't the kind of place where I felt like I could truly build something lasting. I wanted a small house, a family, and a slower pace. Things that felt out of reach in a city where everything costs more than you can afford. So I packed up and moved about 2 hours north, to a small town called Willow Creek. It was a quiet place, surrounded by green fields and old tree-lined streets. Not the kind of town you'd expect to find big crowds or nightlife. But for me, it was perfect. It was exactly what I needed to start over. Before moving here, I spent 3 years living in my stepdad's old house on the outskirts of LA. It was a pretty rundown place, honestly. The kind of house where the walls felt like they could fall apart at any moment. I remember the long, cold winter nights, sitting in a room that was barely heated, listening to the rain tapping against the window. It wasn't glamorous, but it was all I could afford. Most of my days were spent working at a little cafe, just scraping by. No friends nearby, no family close by. It felt like a constant routine of waking up, working, and then crashing into bed at night. I was lonely, but I knew it was temporary. I just had to keep my head down and push through it. 3 years of living that way, I was finally ready for a change. That's when I found Willow Creek. It wasn't too far from LA, but it felt like a world apart. I wanted something quieter, somewhere I could breathe without feeling like I was drowning in deadlines and bills. The first few months in Willow Creek were tough. Moving to a new place is never easy, especially when you don't know anyone. But then, I met Callie. She worked at a small bakery in town, a cozy spot that smelled like fresh bread and coffee every morning. I went there almost every day for my coffee, and it didn't take long before we started chatting. She had this calm, friendly vibe, and I could tell right away she wasn't one of those people who needed the spotlight. Just someone who loved simple things, like making pastries and watching the world go by. One day as I was waiting for her to wrap up my pastry, she said, "You're not from around here, are you? I haven't seen you in the neighborhood before." I was a little surprised but smiled and nodded. "Yeah, I just moved here recently. I'm Alex." She smiled back. "Well, welcome to Willow Creek. I hope you like it here." There was something about the way she spoke that made me feel at ease. She wasn't just being polite, it felt like she genuinely cared. Over the next few weeks, we started talking more. She told me about her life in the town, how she woke up early every day to bake, and how much she loved the simplicity of it all. Callie wasn't the type to make a big deal out of things. She just found joy in the little things, the people, the seasons, the quiet moments. And the more we talked, the more I realized that this was exactly what I had been looking for. A life that was grounded, peaceful, and full of small but meaningful moments. It wasn't long before I realized I was falling for her. Callie seemed to be everything I was looking for, easygoing, kind, and someone who saw the beauty in a quiet life. I started imagining us building a future together, something real and lasting. The idea of us having a little house in Willow Creek, growing old together, it seemed like the dream I'd always had. But of course, life doesn't always work out the way you expect. Moving to a small town wasn't a magical fix for everything. Some dreams take longer to build than others. But even so, I felt like I was on the right path. I wasn't rushing things, but I was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this simple dream of mine could actually come true. My relationship with Callie has lasted for 4 years now, full of good memories and big plans. It all began one spring when I just moved to Willow Creek, a small town surrounded by rolling green fields and trees lining the main street. Back then, our connection felt as natural as the wildflowers that grew along the roadside. Callie was beautiful, magnetic, and had this unique spark that made her stand out from anyone I'd ever known. She was like a fresh breeze, a bright spot in the calm life I'd chosen. Over time, we got close through our morning coffee meetups and talks about everyday life. I'd pick up little things about her with each conversation, her warm smile and quiet strength, making me feel like I'd finally found the person I wanted to be with. We even started making some plans. One day, we'd buy a house, get married, maybe even start a family. Every weekend we'd drive to a new area just outside town, wandering along trails, seeing places that were new to both of us. Once in June, we decided to hike to a waterfall deep in the woods. It was a warm, bright day, and after hours of hiking, we finally reached this hidden spot where the water cascaded down into a crystal-clear pool. Kali looked so at home there, standing with her hand in the water, a look of pure peace on her face. In that moment, I just knew I wanted to share my life with her. But love isn't always simple. Despite all the great memories, our relationship has had its share of ups and downs. Kali would sometimes pull away suddenly and act distant for no reason I could understand. A few years ago, on her birthday, I planned a quiet dinner with candles, flowers, and a letter I'd written for her, sharing all the things I loved about her and our future together. When she came over, she seemed a bit withdrawn, and when I handed her the letter, she just set it down, barely glancing at it. Later that night, she left without saying much. I was left sitting in a room that felt emptier than ever. As we continued dating, Kali would occasionally go through these distant phases. Once, when we were walking around town, she suddenly stopped and started to cry. I had no idea why, but I just held her, trying to be supportive. She told me that she sometimes felt like she was lost, like life was a maze she couldn't find her way out of. I could tell she was wrestling with something deep, but she kept it locked away. There were times I'd wonder if she was just going through a rough patch, but other times, I worried there might be something I was missing. When I asked her about it, she'd often just say she needed time to figure things out on her own. I figured maybe it was stress, or something she wasn't ready to share yet. She also had bursts of energy that kept me guessing. Once, she suggested we move to a big city, maybe Seattle or San Francisco, and try a new life together. I was a bit shocked, but decided to go with her idea. We spent a week in Seattle, exploring the city's coffee shops, old bookstores, and art exhibits. By the end of it, though, she admitted she missed the calm of Willow Creek. She said she didn't belong in a place so fast-paced, yet part of her still craved the change. I got the sense that she was just as unsure of what she wanted as I was of what she might do next. So yeah, our relationship's been complicated, but I couldn't help loving her, and I held on to the hope that over time, she'd find some peace. I thought maybe if I was patient enough, she'd feel secure enough to fully commit. And for a while, things were good. We went back to talking about a future together, a small home with a garden, where she could plant sunflowers and vegetables and raise kids with the same values we both cherished. We even talked about what it'd be like to wake up each morning, grab coffee, and wander through our own little backyard garden. But as much as I tried to reassure her and myself, there was always this nagging feeling that things might not last. Willow Creek, a quiet town with green fields and open roads, had been the backdrop for all our dreams, and I hoped it'd stay that way. I believed if love was strong enough, we could get through anything. When I told Kali that I'd be heading back to my dad's ranch for the winter to help him out, she didn't take it well. It was a 4-hour drive from Seattle, where we'd been living together in a modest one-bedroom apartment with a view of the skyline. Winters at my dad's place were always tough. The ranch was remote, with miles of open land and old barns that needed constant upkeep. My dad was getting older, and I'd made the decision to spend a few months with him to help get the place ready for the season. I'd still be coming back to Seattle every 2 weeks to see Kali, but even that wasn't enough to ease her frustration. "I just don't see why you have to go for so long," she'd say, her voice tinged with irritation every time I brought it up. "Can he manage with someone local?" I'd explain that he needed family around, especially in the winter months. But every time she'd just sigh and go quiet, the kind of silence that always made me feel uneasy. Kali wasn't usually this clingy, so her reaction surprised me. I figured once I'd gone, she'd come around. When I finally left Seattle, it felt strange leaving her behind. I drove east toward the ranch, watching the city skyline disappear in my rearview mirror, feeling both excited to spend time with my dad and a little unsettled about Kali's reaction. She'd promised she'd be fine, but the way she kept bringing up the subject made me wonder if something else was going on. At the ranch, life settled into a steady rhythm. My dad and I would spend our days fixing fences, clearing brush, and stacking firewood to prepare for the cold months ahead. There was something grounding about the work, being out there under the wide open sky, just me, my dad, and the land. And though it was only a few hours from Seattle, it felt like a world away from our city apartment. Every night, I'd call Kali from the old landline in the kitchen, or my cell, if I could get a signal outside. But even in those calls, something felt off. She was distant, always in a rush to end the conversation. One night, just before Thanksgiving, I called her after a long day of hauling wood. She sounded cheerful enough, but there was a guardedness in her tone. When I asked her how her day went, she mentioned going out with some friends from work. One name kept coming up: Brad. I hadn't met him, but she seemed to talk about him more and more, as if he'd become part of her regular social circle. Brad and I grabbed a drink after work, she'd say. He's such a good listener. I'd feel a twinge of something, maybe jealousy, maybe just unease, but I brushed it off. Kali had friends, and I wanted to trust her. Still, there were odd little things, like how she'd keep her phone on silent when we were together, always turned face down on the table. I chalked it up to privacy, not wanting to be the kind of person who questioned everything. When I came back to Seattle for a weekend visit in early December, things felt different. The city was lit up for the holidays, and I'd imagined we'd spend a cozy weekend together. Maybe even go see the Christmas lights at Pike Place Market, like we'd done the year before. But from the moment I arrived, Kali seemed distracted. At dinner, her phone buzzed on the table, and she quickly glanced at it, her face unreadable. "Who's that?" I asked casually, hoping she'd say something that would put my mind at ease. "Oh, just Brad," she said, brushing it off as if it was nothing. But that name, Brad, was starting to gnaw at me. After dinner, we went back to our apartment, and I noticed she was unusually quiet. I asked if she wanted to talk about anything, but she just shook her head, forcing a smile. She said everything was fine, but as she drifted off to sleep beside me, I lay awake, wondering if something had changed between us. When I got back to the ranch, life returned to its steady routine, but the calls with Kali grew shorter and less frequent. She was busy with work or out with friends most evenings. One weekend, when I couldn't make it back to Seattle, she sent me a quick text. "Heading to a concert with Brad and some others from work. Call you tomorrow?" Reading that, I felt a pang of something sharp in my chest. I tried to ignore it, but it stayed with me. The next time I was back in Seattle, right before Christmas, we met for lunch at a cafe near our apartment. It was one of those chilly, overcast days, with gray clouds hanging low over the city. I'd pictured a warm, relaxed catch-up, but from the moment I walked in, I sensed a tension between us. She seemed preoccupied, glancing at her phone from time to time. When I finally asked about Brad, she got defensive. "Why are you so interested in him all of a sudden?" she snapped. "I'm just curious," I said, taken aback by her tone. "You talk about him a lot." "He's just a friend, Alex. Can't you trust me?" Her words stung. I wanted to trust her, but every time she mentioned him, it felt like another wedge driving us apart. That night, as we sat on the couch in our living room, the city lights twinkling outside our window, I asked if everything was really okay between us. She sighed, her face softening. "Alex, you're just overthinking things. I love you, okay? Just stop worrying." I nodded, but deep down, the doubts were building. I wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the trust we'd built over the years. But with every weekend apart, every vague answer, it felt like that trust was slipping through my fingers. By January, I was making the trip to the ranch less frequently, partly because of the winter storms, and partly because I wanted to be back in Seattle to keep an eye on things. The ranch was still quiet and peaceful, but even there, I couldn't escape the creeping doubts. One snowy night, I was chopping wood with my dad when he asked if something was bothering me. I hesitated. then told him about Kali and Brad. My dad, a quiet man by nature, just nodded thoughtfully and said, "Son, sometimes the smallest things can tell you the most." His words echoed in my mind as I drove back to Seattle the next weekend. I arrived home late, the apartment dark and quiet. I found Kali sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. She looked up, startled, as I came in. "Oh, you're back," she said, her tone oddly flat. I dropped my bag, feeling the weight of all the questions I'd been carrying. "Kali," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "is there something going on between you and Brad?" She looked at me, and for a moment, there was something unreadable in her eyes. But then she shook her head, giving me a tired smile. "Alex, you're being ridiculous." I wanted to believe her, wanted to push the doubts aside. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the hum of the city outside our window, I knew things would never be the same. Those small doubts had grown into something too big to ignore, like a quiet storm gathering on the horizon. By the third month at my dad's ranch, I was counting down the days until I could head back to Seattle to see Kali. Winter was dragging on, and while the work at the ranch kept me busy, I missed her. We'd been keeping in touch as best as we could, even with the patchy cell reception out there. But lately, our conversations felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a distance I hadn't felt before. Then, just a few days before my planned trip home, Kali called to say she wasn't feeling well. "It's just a bad cold or something," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You don't need to come back yet. I wouldn't want you to see me like this." I felt a pang of disappointment. I'd been looking forward to that weekend for weeks, to seeing her, and having a break from the cold ranch work. But I didn't want to push her if she was feeling self-conscious about being sick. "Are you sure you'll be okay on your own?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. She laughed weakly. "Of course, Alex, it's just a bug. I'll be fine. Just stay with your dad for now." It felt strange. Usually, Kali wanted me by her side whenever she wasn't feeling well. I remembered times she'd call me just to bring her soup or sit with her when she had the flu. But this time, she seemed almost insistent that I stay away. Something about it gnawed at me, but I decided to respect her wishes. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself she just needed a little space. The following week, I kept trying to check in on her, but getting in touch was nearly impossible. Every call would go straight to voicemail, and my texts were met with long delays. Finally, one evening, she messaged me back with a strange explanation. Her phone had accidentally gone through the wash, and she was using an old one until she could get it fixed. The message struck me as odd. I mean, we've all heard of phones getting ruined in the wash, but knowing Kali, she was always careful with her things. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. She promised she'd have her phone fixed soon, and I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. But days turned into a week, and her communication stayed sporadic. Sometimes, I'd go days without hearing from her, only to get a short text saying, "Feeling better, just tired," or "Just taking it easy today." As more time passed, I started to feel like something was slipping away. One evening, as I finished up some repairs on the barn, my dad noticed me looking distant. He offered me a beer, and we sat down in the barn's warmth, watching the sunset over the frosty fields. Finally he asked, "Something up with Kali?" I shrugged, not sure how to put my feelings into words. "I don't know, Dad. She's been acting strange lately. She says she's been sick, but it's just odd. She doesn't want me to come home, her phone's apparently broken, she's just been hard to reach." My dad, a man of few words, just looked at me thoughtfully. "You think she's hiding something?" he asked quietly. I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that Kali was just going through something, and needed time. But my dad's question stuck with me. Was she hiding something? Was there more going on that she didn't want me to know? Determined to set my mind at ease, I decided to surprise her. I figured if she was still unwell, I could at least be there to help out. The next weekend, I packed a bag and headed back to Seattle without telling her, determined to clear the air and maybe bring her some comfort. When I got to our apartment though, her car was gone, and the lights were off. I figured maybe she'd gone to the store, so I let myself in and waited. Hours passed, and eventually I dozed off on the couch. Around midnight, the sound of the front door opening woke me. I sat up, bleary-eyed, just in time to see Callie walking in. She stopped, visibly startled, her hand flying to her mouth. "Alex, what are you doing here?" Her voice sounded more shocked than pleased. "I wanted to surprise you," I said, forcing a smile. "I missed you, and I wanted to see how you were doing." She seemed to collect herself, offering a strained smile. "Oh, that's sweet. I didn't expect you." The awkwardness between us hung heavy in the air. I couldn't help but notice that she looked perfectly fine, no signs of the illness that had apparently kept her bridden for weeks. Her hair was done, her makeup looked fresh, and she was dressed in nice clothes, not exactly what I expected to see if she'd just been at home sick. The next morning, I casually asked if she'd been out with anyone that night. She shrugged, telling me she'd just gone for a drive to get some air. It felt like there was something unsaid, but I let it go, not wanting to push her. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that her explanation didn't quite add up. As I drove back to the ranch later that day, the doubts grew stronger. I tried to brush them aside, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But a part of me knew that things had changed. Callie was keeping something from me, and the worst part was, I didn't know if I'd ever find out what it was. Back at the ranch, life continued in its steady rhythm, but I felt more and more like I was drifting away from Callie. Calls were fewer, texts were shorter, and when I did manage to reach her, her responses were vague, often avoiding my questions. Winter was giving way to spring, and the snow was melting, but I felt like something in our relationship had been frozen, left out in the cold too long to thaw. It wasn't long after that when I made one last attempt to get some answers. I called her one evening, after finishing up some work on the fence. She answered on the second ring, but her tone was curt. "Callie, is everything okay? I feel like we're not being completely open with each other," I said, my voice betraying the worry I'd been holding back. There was a long pause, and I could hear her sigh on the other end of the line. "Alex, you're overthinking this. It's just been a rough few months. I've been stressed, okay? Just give me some space." The words stung, but I forced myself to accept them. I wanted to believe that space was all she needed. But as I stood there, phone in hand, staring out at the wide, open fields of my dad's ranch, I couldn't help but feel that this was the beginning of the end. After months of strange behavior and mixed messages, I decided it was time to return to Seattle to try and reconnect with Callie, hoping to find some trace of the happiness we once shared. I left the ranch early on a Friday morning in late March, watching as the snow thinned along the road and gave way to the familiar city skyline. The drive was quiet, giving me hours to think about how things had changed, and I kept wondering if all of this was in my head or if Callie and I had genuinely started to drift apart. When I finally pulled up to our apartment, a part of me was hoping that seeing her in person would erase the doubts that had been gnawing at me. But the moment I walked through the door, I could sense the distance between us hadn't faded. She greeted me with a smile, but it was hesitant, like she wasn't entirely sure she was happy to see me. Her eyes darted around the room, and her hands fidgeted more than usual. I tried to chalk it up to her being caught off guard, but it was hard not to notice the change. Over the next couple of days, I did my best to get us back into a rhythm. I suggested we visit our favorite coffee shop downtown, or take a walk through Gasworks Park, a spot we both loved for its view of the city and Lake Union. But she was either too tired, or busy with work, every time I suggested something, leaving us mostly at home. And even when we were just relaxing on the couch, it felt like she was miles away. One evening, we were sitting in our small kitchen, sharing a bottle of wine, when Callie suddenly brought up Brad's name in the middle of a casual conversation. She'd been talking about work, but her face lit up when she mentioned Brad, describing how he'd helped her with some project and how funny he was in the office. There was something about the way she talked about him, her voice softening, her eyes brightening, that sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard her mention Brad before, but this time, it felt different, as if there was a deeper meaning beneath her words. I tried to brush it off, not wanting to jump to conclusions, But that night, as we lay in bed, the doubt lingered. I couldn't help but wonder if her connection with Brad was more than just a friendship. She'd always been open about her friends, but now, anytime I asked about him, she'd get defensive, or change the subject, making me feel like I was prying into something she didn't want me to know. Then, one night, Callie came home later than usual. She was clearly tipsy, her laugh louder, her movements a little too carefree. I helped her get settled, trying to ignore the feeling of dread building in my chest. But as she drifted off to sleep, her phone buzzed on the nightstand, lighting up briefly with Brad's name on the screen. I stared at it, my heart pounding. I knew I shouldn't invade her privacy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed answers. Quietly, I reached over and picked up her phone, hesitating as I opened her messages. My stomach dropped as I read through the string of texts. They weren't explicit, but there was an undeniable intimacy between her and Brad. Flirty jokes, late-night messages, and casual miss you notes, each one felt like a small betrayal. My hands trembled as I read the words, feeling a wave of anger, confusion, and heartbreak all at once. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in any longer. As we were having breakfast, I brought it up, trying to keep my voice calm. "Callie," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I saw some of the messages between you and Brad last night." She looked up sharply, her expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "You went through my phone?" I nodded, bracing myself for her reaction. "I needed to know if there was something you weren't telling me." She rolled her eyes, laughing in a way that felt cold. "Alex, those messages are nothing. Brad and I joke around. That's just our sense of humor." "But miss you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Callie, that doesn't seem like a joke to me." She sighed, brushing it off as if it were no big deal. "You're overreacting. Brad's just a friend, okay? He's been there for me when you haven't. I didn't think you'd get so worked up over a few texts." Her words stung. She was deflecting, downplaying everything, and it only fueled my doubts. She insisted that it was harmless, that I was reading too much into it, but no matter how many times she tried to reassure me, the pit in my stomach only grew. After that conversation, things between us felt even more strained. I tried to act normal, but every time she was on her phone, I'd wonder if she was messaging Brad. I'd catch myself glancing at her screen out of the corner of my eye, hoping to catch some hint that might put my mind at ease. But she was careful, keeping her phone close, her messages private. As the weeks went by, I found myself becoming someone I barely recognized, paranoid, constantly second-guessing everything she said or did. It was exhausting, but I couldn't let it go. One afternoon, I took a walk through Discovery Park to clear my head, hoping the fresh air and open space would help me gain some perspective. But even there, surrounded by Seattle's natural beauty, my mind kept returning to those messages, to the way her voice softened when she mentioned Brad's name. I confided in a close friend, hoping an outside perspective might help me make sense of things. He listened quietly as I poured out my frustrations, his face thoughtful. "Look, Alex," he finally said, "maybe there's something going on, or maybe she's just gotten too close to this guy because you've been away. Either way, you have to decide if you can trust her, because this is going to eat you up if you let it." His words echoed in my mind, and I knew he was right. But trust felt like an impossible thing to give, when every fiber of my being was telling me something was wrong. Callie and I tried to go about our routines, but the tension was always there, like a shadow hanging over us. Every time she left the apartment, every time she came home a little late, I felt a pang of suspicion that I couldn't ignore. One rainy evening, as I sat alone in our living room, the city lights reflecting off the wet streets outside, I realized I couldn't keep living like this. I needed answers, closure, something to either confirm or dispel my doubts. And if Callie wasn't going to give me the truth willingly, I'd have to find it myself. Despite the growing doubts eating away at me, I still wanted to believe that Callie and I could have the life we'd once dreamed about. I'd been thinking about proposing for a long time, and even now, with all the strange distance and her odd behavior, part of me still hoped that marriage might be the thing that would bring us back together. Maybe if we took that step, we could leave all this uncertainty behind. I wanted her to know I was committed. that I was willing to move past these recent issues and start fresh. So I began planning what I thought would be a perfect proposal, something meaningful that would remind her of all we'd built together. I'd heard about this spa just outside Seattle that offered private serene experiences for couples, with outdoor hot springs nestled in a forest, surrounded by mountain views. It felt like the perfect setting, and I imagined us spending the day together, relaxing, with no distractions, just us. I envisioned getting down on one knee at sunset, surrounded by the beauty of nature, and asking her to spend her life with me. So, I went ahead and booked the appointment, wanting everything to be ready. A few weeks before the planned date, I took an afternoon off to pick out a ring. I found myself wandering through a small jewelry shop in downtown Seattle, staring at cases filled with rings sparkling under the lights. I eventually chose one that felt right, simple yet elegant, a single diamond set on a gold band. It was classic, timeless, and I thought it suited her perfectly. As I held the ring, imagining the look on her face, I almost forgot about the doubts that had been haunting me. I wanted to believe in this future, in the life we'd once dreamed of sharing. But every time I tried to fully commit to the plan, those memories would resurface. The messages I'd seen on her phone, the defensive way she spoke about Brad, the quiet distance that had grown between us. The ring felt heavier in my hand with every passing day. I kept questioning myself, wondering if I was setting myself for heartbreak. I didn't want to be that person who ignored obvious red flags just to chase an illusion. Part of me needed answers, a sense of clarity, before taking that leap. One evening, about a week before the planned proposal, I found myself wandering the streets of Seattle, lost in thought. I walked past our favorite spots, our go-to coffee shop, the small bookstore where we'd spent hours browsing, the park where we'd once had a picnic on a rainy day, laughing as we tried to keep everything dry under a single umbrella. Each place held a memory, a small piece of the life we'd built together. But now, those memories felt bittersweet, like they belonged to a different time, to different people. I kept asking myself, is this really the person I want to spend my life with? And more importantly, does she feel the same? In the days leading up to the proposal, my unease grew. I started paying closer attention to Kali's actions, her words, and the subtle changes in her behavior. She'd say she was going out for work dinners, but she'd come back later than usual, with vague explanations about how they'd gone long. I wanted to believe her, to take her at her word. But every time I asked for details, she'd give me that same look, like I was overstepping, like I was the one doing something wrong. Eventually, I confided in my friend Mark, someone who had known us since the early days of our relationship. Over coffee one morning, I shared everything, from the messages I'd seen to my growing suspicions. Mark listened quietly, nodding now and then, his face unreadable. "Look," he said after a long pause, "I know you love her. I've seen it from the start, but maybe this proposal can wait until you're sure. Marriage won't fix something if it's already broken, Alex." His words hit me hard. I knew he was right, but it was painful to accept. I'd been hoping that this proposal would be the thing to bring us back to each other, to reignite whatever spark had faded. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the voice telling me to be cautious, to make sure that I wasn't making a mistake. The following weekend, instead of going through with the proposal as planned, I decided to postpone it. I didn't tell Kali about my change of heart. I just canceled the spa appointment, slipping the ring back into its box and tucking it away in my dresser. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, as if I'd both saved and lost something important. From that moment on, I found myself watching Kali more closely. I knew it wasn't healthy, that I was letting doubt take control, but I couldn't stop. I started noticing the little things, the way she'd keep her phone on silent, the times she'd look away when I asked her where she'd been, the way she'd smile when she mentioned Brad's name, even though she'd try to play it off as casual. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and each day, I felt further from finding the answers. One night, we were supposed to meet for dinner at a restaurant near Pike Place Market. I got there early, hoping we could have a relaxed evening, but as the minutes ticked by, she didn't show. I called her, and after a few rings, she finally picked up, her voice breathless. "Hey, sorry, I'm running a bit late, Got caught up at work, she said, her tone a bit too bright. I nodded, feeling the familiar pang of doubt. No problem, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Take your time. When she finally arrived, about 45 minutes late, she seemed flustered, her cheeks flushed. She laughed it off, telling me about how crazy her day had been. But as I watched her, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being entirely honest. It was a quiet dinner, filled with forced smiles and empty conversations, and by the end of it, I felt more alone than I had before. After that night, I knew I had to find out the truth, whatever it was. I couldn't keep living in this state of limbo, constantly questioning her loyalty and doubting my own sanity. I didn't want to believe that Kali would betray me, that the woman I'd loved for so long could be hiding something so significant. But I also couldn't ignore the signs that were right in front of me. With a heavy heart, I decided that the only way forward was to seek clarity, to confront whatever it was that had come between us. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew that I couldn't take that next step, couldn't propose, couldn't imagine a future, until I was sure. And so, with the ring still hidden in my dresser, I set out to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When my suspicions reached a breaking point, I decided I needed real answers, ones I couldn't get on my own. I'd tried to believe Kali's reassurances, tried to let the tension pass, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was terribly wrong. So, after wrestling with the decision for days, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. It was a chilly Seattle morning when I met up with him at a small, discreet coffee shop near Capitol Hill. The investigator, a middle-aged man named Carl, was no nonsense, with a quiet intensity and a calm demeanor that made me feel both reassured and anxious about what I was about to uncover. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, nodding every so often but saying little. By the end of our conversation, I'd given him all the details I could: Kali's habits, her usual haunts, and of course, the name Brad. Over the next few days, I tried to carry on with my life as normally as I could, but the waiting was brutal. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would jump, hoping it was Carl with some news, dreading what he might find. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I'd had with Kali over the last few months, wondering if I'd missed something obvious. Finally, after a week of silence, Carl called me and asked to meet. His tone was businesslike, and I couldn't tell if that was a good or bad sign. We met at the same coffee shop, where he laid out a small stack of photos and reports in front of me. As he began to explain his findings, I could feel a cold knot forming in my stomach. Kali and Brad aren't just friends, Carl started, his voice steady but grim. He pushed a photograph across the table. A picture of Kali and Brad walking hand in hand outside a bar in Belltown, the same bar she told me she sometimes went to with her work friends. I stared at the image, feeling a mixture of disbelief and anger rising inside me. It was one thing to suspect, but another thing entirely to see the truth captured in a photograph. As Carl continued, he revealed more details that made my heart sink further. Kali and Brad weren't just occasionally meeting up, they were openly going out together when I was away, sharing dinners, walks, even attending events as a couple. In one photo, they were at a small art gallery downtown, standing close, looking at each other with an intimacy that cut me to the core. But it wasn't just Brad. Carl's investigation revealed that Kali had been meeting up with other men as well. One of them was someone I'd never heard of, a man named Marcus, whom she'd apparently been seeing around the same time. They'd met at a social event, and according to Carl's findings, their interactions hadn't been purely platonic. The photos showed her laughing with him over drinks at a bar in Capitol Hill, looking as if she hadn't a care in the world. With every new revelation, the betrayal felt deeper, as if each person she'd been with chipped away at the life I thought we'd built together. Carl's final report was devastating. Kali wasn't the person I thought she was. She hadn't just grown close to a coworker, she'd been leading a double life, seeing multiple men, each interaction hidden behind her careful excuses and vague explanations. Everything I'd been questioning, every suspicion that had gnawed at me for months, was now painfully confirmed. As I stared down at the photos, my mind went numb. The memories of our time together, the plans, the dreams, the ring still tucked away in my dresser, felt like a cruel joke. I could still remember the nights we'd spent talking about our future, about the family we'd one day have. But now, those memories were tainted, overlaid with the harsh truth of who Kali really was and what she'd been doing behind my back. I thanked Carl, not knowing what else to say. He gave me a sympathetic nod and left me alone with the evidence of my broken relationship spread out before me. I sat there for a long time, not moving, just letting the shock settle in. The betrayal ran deeper than I'd imagined, and I realized I could never go back to the life I'd had with her. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. That evening, I went home to our apartment in a haze, each step heavier than the last. Kali wasn't there when I arrived, so I sat down in the living room, surrounded by the traces of our life together. The photos on the wall, the books we'd shared, the small trinkets from trips we'd taken. The place felt different, almost foreign, as if I were a stranger in my own home. One evening, after days of sleepless nights and unspoken anger, I decided I couldn't go on like this. I needed closure, needed to look Kali in the eyes and hear the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I called her and told her to come by our apartment. There was no escaping this confrontation. When she arrived, the tension in the room was thick. She looked at me, her eyes darting around, sensing something serious. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice, and laid out the evidence I had gathered, the photos, the times and dates, every lie and excuse she'd given me. I watched as her face went pale, her hands starting to shake as she realized she couldn't deny it anymore. In a state of panic, she finally broke down, admitting her mistakes. Tears streamed down her face as she begged for forgiveness, telling me that it was all a momentary weakness, that she'd been lost and confused. "You're the one I truly love," she sobbed, reaching out to touch my hand. But her words felt hollow, her tears insincere. Anger boiled up inside me, overpowering any shred of sympathy I might have had left. "Kali, how could you do this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "We had a life together. I trusted you. I was ready to spend my life with you. And for what? For cheap thrills with Brad and who knows how many others." She tried to explain, offering excuses that only fueled my rage. She said it was loneliness, that I had been away too much at my dad's ranch, that she'd felt neglected. Each excuse felt like a slap to the face, a way to twist the blame onto me. But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't accept that she'd turned our relationship into a lie because of a few moments of weakness. Finally, I told her it was over. That there was no path forward for us, not after what she'd done. But as I stood to leave, she grabbed my arm, her face pale with desperation. "No, Alex, please," she cried, her grip tight. "Don't leave me. I don't know what I'll do if you go. I can't live without you." Her voice dropped to a whisper as she hinted at dark, disturbing thoughts, making it clear that she might harm herself if I walked out that door. Her words struck a twisted chord of fear and guilt within me. Part of me wanted to believe she was sincere, that maybe this was her way of admitting she needed help. But another part of me knew this was manipulation, a desperate ploy to keep me around when she realized she was losing control. I pulled away, feeling both exhausted and numb. "Get help, Kali," I said, my voice cold and detached. "I can't do this anymore. I won't let you drag me down with you." With that, I left the apartment, ignoring her pleas as I walked into the cold night air, the city lights blurred by my own tears. I had ended it finally, but instead of relief, I felt a crushing weight of despair. The days that followed were a blur of anger, hurt, and self-doubt. I felt like I was floating through my own life, disconnected from everything and everyone. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me constantly, a dark cloud that followed me wherever I went. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't escape the memories of our relationship, now tarnished and ruined. One Friday night, unable to bear the silence of my empty apartment, I found myself wandering into a dimly lit bar near our place. The bartender gave me a sympathetic nod as I ordered my first drink, then my second, and then more after that. Each sip dulled the pain, at least for a moment. I kept drinking, pushing myself to forget, to drown the images of Kali and the lies she'd fed me. As the hours passed, the alcohol took hold, and I lost track of time. The bar became a haze of faces and voices, a blur of meaningless conversations that I could barely comprehend. By the time I stumbled out into the street, the city around me felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake from. Everything felt distorted, both distant and overwhelmingly close at the same time. Without fully realizing what I was doing, I found myself heading toward Kali's apartment. Anger and pain bubbled up inside me, and in my intoxicated state, all I wanted was answers. Closure. Something to make the hurt go away. I banged on her door, yelling her name, demanding that she come out and face me. My voice echoed down the quiet hallway, loud and uncontrolled, fueled by all the emotions I'd been holding back for weeks. Kali eventually opened the door, looking both shocked and terrified as she saw me, clearly drunk and unhinged. She tried to calm me down, but her attempts only made me angrier. I couldn't stop myself, couldn't hold back the torrent of accusations and hurt that spilled out. I barely recognized my own voice as I hurled words at her, my vision blurring from both rage and the alcohol coursing through my veins. It wasn't long before the neighbors, disturbed by the noise, called the police. When the officers arrived, I was still shouting, my hands clenched, tears streaming down my face. I barely remember the words they said to me, only that they took me by the arm, guiding me away from her door, as I slumped in defeat. I was taken to the police station, where I spent the night in a holding cell, the cold metal bench and the harsh fluorescent lights bringing me back to the brutal reality of what I'd become. As I sat there, sobering up, shame washed over me. I'd lost control, allowed myself to become consumed by anger and betrayal. I realized that I'd hit rock bottom, that my grief had pushed me to a place I never thought I'd reach. The humiliation, the self-disgust, it was almost too much to bear. I felt like a stranger to myself, a man who'd lost not only his love, but his dignity. The following morning, they released me with a warning, the officer's stern gaze a reminder of the line I'd crossed. I returned to my apartment in silence, my mind heavy with regret. The incident at Kali's door had stripped away the last shred of pride I'd held onto, forcing me to confront the darkness that had taken hold of me. In the days that followed, I made a promise to myself. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, letting the anger and betrayal consume me. I needed to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of myself that I'd lost in the chaos. It wouldn't be easy, and I knew it would take time, but I couldn't let Kali's betrayal define me any longer. I was determined to move forward, to find a way to heal, no matter how long it took. As painful as it was, that night marked a turning point. It was a harsh reminder of how far I'd fallen, but also a wake-up call, a chance to start again, to leave the pain behind, and rebuild my life from the ground up. After that disastrous night, I knew there was nothing left for me in this relationship. I had crossed a line, let anger consume me, and paid the price for it. But the real damage had already been done. Kali's betrayal had shattered me, and there was no going back. I wanted to move on, to find peace. But before I left, I wanted her to face the consequences of what she'd done. Over the following days, I pulled myself together and started to plan my final act of closure. This wasn't about revenge, or so I told myself. It was about bringing truth to light, making sure that everyone who mattered knew who Kali really was. I gathered every piece of evidence I had, the photos, the reports from the investigator, the screenshots of messages I'd seen. I organized everything, piecing together the timeline of her lies, each one stinging as I laid it all out. Then I compiled it all into a single file, a document that painted a picture of the person she'd become and the web of deception she'd spun. It was painful, reliving every moment, but I wanted there to be no doubts, no room for excuses. I was meticulous, checking every detail, making sure that what I was presenting was undeniable. Once it was ready, I sent the file to a select group, her close friends, a few family members who knew me well, even her parents. I wrote a short, straightforward message, explaining that I was sharing this because I felt they deserved to know the truth about what had happened between us. I didn't embellish or accuse, I let the facts speak for themselves. Then I pressed send and watched the message disappear into the ether. I half expected some of them to reach out to question or condemn me for airing such personal details. But instead the silence was deafening. Over the next few hours, I received only a handful of responses, most of them expressing shock, some offering me sympathy. A few of her friends even admitted that they'd had suspicions but hadn't wanted to believe it. It was strangely validating, knowing that others had seen the same cracks that I had tried to ignore. After that, I made my decision to leave. I didn't see the point in staying in Seattle, surrounded by memories that had lost all meaning. I packed up my things, carefully boxing up parts of my life, each item a reminder of the dreams I'd once had, now discarded. The apartment felt emptier than ever, as I took down the last few photos of us, leaving bare walls and a hollow silence. I left no note, no final message for Kali. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing she still had a hold on me. My only parting words were the cold truth I'd shared with those closest to her, a truth that would linger far longer than any goodbye. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to realize that her lies had consequences that extended far beyond just us. On my last day in Seattle, I took one final walk through the city, visiting the places that had once felt like home. I walked by the coffee shop, where we'd spent lazy Sunday mornings, the bookstore, where we'd gotten lost in endless conversations, the small park where I'd once considered proposing to her. Each place felt like a chapter in a story that had ended too soon, a story rewritten by betrayal and hurt. By evening, I was ready. I loaded my belongings into my car, took one last look at the apartment building, and drove away without looking back. I felt a strange sense of freedom, mixed with an undeniable sadness. I knew I was leaving behind a part of myself, a version of me that had been naive, hopeful, and unguarded. In the days that followed, I heard bits and pieces of the aftermath. Friends told me that Kali had tried to defend herself, that she'd reached out to some of those who'd received the evidence, trying to explain her actions, downplay what had happened. But the damage was done. Her reputation, her carefully constructed image, everything was in ruins. She was left to face the consequences of her choices alone, just as I had once faced the reality of her betrayal. As I settled into a new life, far from Seattle, I felt the first glimmers of peace. The scars remained, of course, and there were nights when the memories still haunted me, when I wondered if things could have been different. But as the weeks turned into months, the weight of it all began to lift. I focused on rebuilding, on reclaiming my sense of self, and slowly, I began to move forward. Looking back, I knew that exposing the truth had been the closure I needed. It was a reminder that, despite the pain, I'd come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more resilient. I'd left behind the betrayal, the lies, and the broken promises, and in doing so, I'd made room for a new beginning. A life defined not by what I'd lost, but by what I was determined to build anew.